U.S.-China trade war explained Wo needs who. Between the U.S. and China, a trade war is imminent. On more than 1,000 Chinese products, President Donald Trump has suggested imposing duties. In response, China announced that it would slap tariffs on U.S. imports, especially food items. The trade war that will result if they do so would be devastating for all nations, not just those two. What might it imply for the environment and the world's food security? Let's look at the situation with soybeans, which China has threatened to import at a 25% tax. Today, soybeans are a common ingredient in the entire food supply chain. As producers meet the rising demand for meat from the middle class, 70% of soy production is used to feed animals, mostly chickens, pigs, and cows. The remainder is used to produce biodiesel, oleochemicals, cooking oil, and other processed goods. A quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are already accounted for by agriculture and land use changes. A new wave of investment in soybean production outside the U.S. will worsen the situation by encouraging even more land removal. The biggest producer and exporter of soybeans is the United States, while China is the biggest buyer, taking in 2/3 of all U.S. exports. Due to the lack of available farmland and sluggish yields, China cannot satisfy its demand for soybeans. However, it has a huge hunger for soybeans. Nearly 100 million metric tons, or 10,000 shipping containers per day, are imported into China each year. What could occur then if American soybean imports are halted? A similar market disturbance like the one that preceded the 2008 food price crisis, when the cost of rice, wheat, and corn nearly doubled over 2 years, may result from such a shift. Changes in China's soybean supply often have a significant impact on the market. China increased its purchases of Brazilian soybeans by 1/3 in March of this year alone compared to the same month last year. The price of U.S. soybean imports into China will increase if imports from other nations take their place. On the other hand, the U.S. can end up with a massive surplus of soybeans, which would result in dumping on overseas markets or a decline in local prices. The agricultural sectors of affected nations have historically experienced long-term effects from this kind of disruption. When the Nixon administration imposed an embargo on soybean exports in the early 1970s, Brazil and Argentina increased their production to fill a gap, starting a trend that is still evident today. More recently, a worldwide land rush was sparked by the 2008 food price crisis. Many food-importing nations lost faith in the ability of global markets to consistently meet the needs of their populations, and as a safeguard against future instability, international and domestic investors purchased huge swaths of farmland across Africa and Asia. This bad pattern could return if there is a trade war between the U.S. and China. To secure its soybean demand and safeguard its supply chains, China may be compelled to look for new borders, which could trigger another round of alleged land grabs. China has increased its agricultural investments abroad over the past 10 years, moving from USD 300 million in 2009 to USD 3.3 billion in 2016, with the majority of that money flowing to Asia. Agrochemical tycoon Syngenta was recently acquired by the Chinese chemical behemoth ChemChina for CHF 43 billion. The negative environmental effects of the global soy footprint may worsen if China and other nations increase soybean output globally. In Brazil and Argentina, soybean production already contributes to deforestation. Between 1990 and 2015, the amount of land in South America used for soy production more than tripled, growing from 17 million to 58 million hectares FAOSTAT. A quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are already accounted for by agriculture and land use changes. A new wave of investment in soybean production outside the U.S. will worsen the situation by encouraging even more land removal. What steps may be taken to prevent disaster? Trade war must first and foremost be forewarned at all costs. However, there are still other chances to take action. Now that the previous wave of foreign land investment has passed, governments in Asia and Africa might put what they've learned to use. Many nations have already enacted reforms to clean up dishonest or insider-driven business practices and better represent the needs of the populace and the environment. A long-lasting remedy for insecure land tenure in rural communities is offered by new land laws in Mali and Benin. To perform a thorough inventory of agreements and enhance the legal framework for foreign investment, Laos imposed a temporary ban on land investments. Due to a lack of agricultural land and stagnating yields, China cannot meet its demand for soybeans. The new East African Community (EAC) model contract for farmland investments, which tightens the procedures for managing social and environmental repercussions and for ensuring that women's land rights are safeguarded, is therefore very pertinent. Last but not least, the dangers posed by current trade tensions present a chance to reconsider present production and consumption habits and restructure food systems. In nations where consumption is excessive, basically all developed nations' meat and dairy consumption must be decreased for the sake of the environment and global food security. A sustainable approach to agricultural production must also be adopted, including a decrease in the use of chemical fertilizers and a promotion of the use of animal dung as a natural fertilizer. By implementing such preventive measures, the globe may create food systems that are sustainable and more robust and can withstand changes in commerce and the environment. Between the US and China, a trade war is imminent. More than 1,000 products imported from China would be subject to tariffs, according to President Donald Trump's proposal. China's response was to announce that it will tax US imports, including food items. The ensuing trade war would be disastrous if they keep going in this direction, and not only for these two nations. What would happen to the security of the world's food supply and environment? Take soybeans as an example. China has threatened to impose a 25% import charge on them. Today, soy is a common ingredient in the entire food supply chain. As growers fulfill the rising demand for meat from the expanding middle classes, 70% of soybean production is used as animal feed, including for chickens, pigs, and cows. The remaining portion is used to make biodiesel, oleochemicals, cooking oil, and other processed food items. About a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are already attributable to agriculture and land use changes. A new wave of investment in soybean production outside of the United States will result in more land clearing, escalating the problem. The biggest producer and exporter of soybeans is the United States, while China is the biggest buyer, taking in 2/3 of all U.S. exports. As a result of its restricted agricultural acreage and sluggish yields, China is unable to meet its demand for soybeans. Nevertheless, China imports 10,000 containers worth of soybeans each day, or close to 100 million metric tons annually. What does it matter if American soybean imports are halted? Such a change might cause significant upheaval in international markets, similar to what happened in the years leading up to the 2008 food price crisis, when the cost of rice, wheat, and corn nearly doubled in only 2 years. Soybean supply fluctuations in China typically have a significant impact on the market. China increased its purchases of Brazilian soybeans by 1/3 in March of this year alone compared to the same month last year. The price of U.S. soybean imports into China will increase if imports from other nations take their place. On the other hand, the United States can end up with a massive surplus of soybeans, which would cause dumping in overseas markets or a decline in domestic market prices. This kind of disruption has historically had lasting effects on the agricultural sectors of the countries involved. When the Nixon administration imposed an embargo on soybean exports in the early 1970s, Brazil and Argentina increased their production to make up the difference, beginning a trend that is still present today. More recently, a worldwide land rush was sparked by the 2008 food price crisis. To protect themselves against future uncertainty, several food importing nations have lost faith in the ability of the global market to dependably feed their populations. As a result, international and domestic investors have purchased vast tracts of agricultural land in Asia and Africa. This regrettable pattern can resurface if there is a trade war between the United States and China. A fresh round of what is known as land grabs could result if China is obliged to look for new frontiers to secure its demand for soybeans and safeguard its supply networks. The amount of money China has invested in agriculture abroad has increased significantly over the past 10 years, rising from $300 million in 2009 to $3.3 billion in 2016. ChemChina, a major player in the Chinese chemical industry, recently paid 43 billion Swiss francs to acquire Swiss agrochemical company Syngenta. Did you like it? Kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative videos.